Gaudeamus omnes in Domino, diem festum celebrantes, sub honore sanctorum omnium.
Welcome to The Way of the Fathers, a podcast sponsored by CatholicCulture.org. I'm your host, Mike Aquilina. Well, it wasn't enough for Constantine to be the first Christian emperor. It wasn't enough to make Christianity the favored religion of the imperial government. Constantine also had to move the capital away from Rome. In fact, he moved it out of Italy entirely. He took a look at the obscure Greek city of Byzantium, and he said to himself, "This is the place." Byzantium was soon to be named Constantinople, after you-know-who. And it was geography that made it such a perfect capital. A military leader like Constantine always asks first, "Can I defend this place?" The answer for Constantinople was emphatically yes. It is surrounded on three sides by water. The land side is relatively narrow, and a general like Constantine would immediately think, "I can build a wall across that." But being defensible is only part of what made Constantinople a perfect capital city. There are plenty of defensible mountaintops in the middle of nowhere, but Constantinople was in the middle of everywhere. Every ship going from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean had to pass right by Constantinople. It was close enough to mount an expedition to the eastern frontier, where the troublesome war with the Persians and the Parthians had been going on for hundreds of years. But it was not close enough to be in serious danger from the Parthians or Persians or whoever was in charge over there at the moment. Before Constantine, Byzantium was never more than moderately important, although it did have the advantage of being able to tax commerce going through the Bosporus between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. But Constantine had more than one reason for putting his new capital there. There was the strategic importance of the place. It was also true that the eastern half of the empire had most of the population and most of the important cities. So governing it all from the west was inefficient. And then there was the fact that the aristocracy in the city of Rome was stubbornly pagan, and indeed would remain so for another century. By moving his capital to a newly founded city, Constantine could refound the empire on a Christian basis, with a capital city that was obviously Christian. It took a lot of ambition to move the capital of the world, but Constantine had a lot of ambition. The historian Socrates Scholasticus, who was a lifelong resident of Constantinople, tells us that the new capital was Constantine's first priority after the Council of Nicaea. Here's what he says. After the synod, the emperor spent some time in recreation, and after the public celebration of his 20th anniversary of his accession, he immediately devoted himself to repairing of the churches. This he carried into effect in other cities, as well as in the city named after him, which was being previously called Byzantium. He enlarged, surrounded with massive walls, and adorned with various edifices. And having rendered it equal to imperial Rome, he named it Constantinople, establishing by law that it should be designated New Rome. This law was engraved on a pillar of stone erected in public view in the Strategium. In the same city, he also built two churches, one of which he named Irene, and the other the Apostles. Nor did he only improve the affairs of the Christians, as I have said, but he also destroyed the superstition of the heathens, for he brought forth their images into public view to ornament the city of Constantinople and set up the Delphic tripods publicly in the hippodrome. So says Socrates Scholasticus. Eusebius, who knew Constantine and was a big fan of the emperor, tells us more about the magnificence of New Rome. He says, "And being fully resolved to distinguish the city which bore his name with special honor, He embellished it with numerous sacred edifices, both memorials of martyrs on the largest scale and other buildings of the most splendid kind, not only within the city itself, but in its vicinity, and thus at the same time he rendered honor to the memory of the martyrs and consecrated his city to the martyrs' God. Being filled too with divine wisdom, he determined to purge the city, which was to be distinguished by his own name, from idolatry of every kind, that henceforth no statues might be worshipped there in the temples of those falsely reputed to be gods, nor any altars defiled by the pollution of blood, that there might be no sacrifices consumed by fire, no demon festivals, nor any of the other ceremonies usually observed by the slaves of superstition. On the other hand, one might see the fountains in the midst of the forum graced with figures representing the Good Shepherd, well known to those who study the sacred oracles, and that of Daniel also, with the lions, forged in brass and resplendent with plates of gold. However, we find that Constantinople was also an outdoor museum of all the greatest art of the ancient pagan world. Eusebius tells us that Constantine pillaged statues of pagan gods from all over the empire and brought them to Constantinople. Here again is what Eusebius says. On the other hand, he used every means to rebuke the superstitious errors of the heathen. Hence, the entrances of their temples in the several cities were left exposed to the weather, being stripped of their doors at his command. The tiling of others was removed, and their roofs destroyed. From others again, the venerable statues of brass, of which the superstition of antiquity had boasted for a long series of years, were exposed to view in all the public places of the imperial city. So that here a Pythian, there a Sminthian Apollo excited the contempt of the beholder, while the Delphic tripods were deposited in the circus, and the muses of Helicon in the palace itself. In short, the city of Constantinople was everywhere filled with brazen statues of the most exquisite workmanship, which had been dedicated in every province, and which the deluded victims of superstition had long vainly honored as gods, with numberless victims and burned sacrifices, though now at length they learned to renounce their error, when the emperor held up the very objects of their worship to be the ridicule and sport of all beholders. Well, by 330, the city was ready for the big transfer, and Constantine moved the seat of Roman government to Constantinople. Of course, the city had to have a bishop, and of course the bishop of Constantinople would be the bishop closest to the emperor. This was a great thing for an ambitious bishop. It was awful for a bishop who put faith and doctrine above ambition. Technically, the bishop of Constantinople was nobody special. For many years after Constantine, the city was the seat of an ordinary bishop, not an archbishop. But to a bishop who wanted influence, it was obviously the place to be. In 339, just 9 years after the capital moved to Constantinople, Eusebius of Nicomedia wangled a transfer to Constantinople. In canon law, it was a downgrade. Nicomedia was an important see, whereas Constantinople was still a suffragan see subject to the town of Heraclea. But Eusebius understood that being close to the emperor was better than having the canonical rank of archbishop. Standing beside Constantine, he could be the most important bishop in the world. We've met Eusebius of Nicomedia before. He's the one who took up the cause of Arius in the Arian controversy, the cause that was apparently defeated when Constantine called the bishops together for the Council of Nicaea. It looked as though Eusebius had picked the losing side, but he was a slippery character, and he was determined to come out on top. He accepted the decision of Nicaea, and then went to work convincing the emperor that his modified form of Arianism light we'll call it, was completely compatible with Nicene Christianity. If only Athanasius and those other fanatics weren't so stubborn, we could have peace in the church. Somehow, by the end of Constantine's reign, it was Eusebius who was doing just fine, and the victors at Nicaea were having all the trouble. When Constantine was on his deathbed, he finally decided it was time to be baptized. Many Christians delayed baptism until near death, supposing that it was better to wash away a lifetime's worth of sin all at once. And who would baptize him? Bishop Eusebius, of course. Already politics in Constantinople was beginning to take on its characteristic form. In fact, the old name for the city has given us a name for that kind of politics, Byzantine. It's the kind of politics where there are plots within plots, and everybody is conspiring against everybody. Constantine himself had killed his own wife and son because he thought they were plotting against him. After Constantine, it only got worse. Constantine's son, Constantius, killed most of his near relatives, perhaps on the grounds that anybody related to him had to be up to no good. One of the few spared was a little boy named Julian, who grew up to be Julian the Apostate, the one whose beard was a running joke in Antioch. So maybe Constantius had the right instinct after all. In the year 381, the first council of Constantinople finally made official what had already been unofficially true. The See of Constantinople was second only to Rome in importance. That made the bishop's seat even more of a prize and the politics around it even more Byzantine. In the year 397, the ancient bishop Nectarius died, and Arcadius the emperor wanted to find a replacement who would impress the people of Constantinople, possibly because Arcadius himself wasn't very impressive. Who better than that hotshot preacher who had been wowing the crowds in Antioch? John Chrysostom, the man who had preached the sermons about the statues, those sermons that had already become standard models for Christian rhetoricians, seemed like just the celebrity bishop for the imperial city. Of course, Constantinople was a big prize, and there were plenty of people who had other opinions about who should be its bishop. One of them was Theophilus, Bishop of Alexandria, who had a friend named Isidore who needed a job. Why not the Constantinople gig? But John had an important booster in Constantinople. Eutropius the eunuch, who pretty much ran the empire under the weak-willed Arcadius, had decided that John was the man for the job. Eutropius was an astute politician, which meant in those days that he had something to blackmail everybody with. There had been some complaints against Theophilus, and they would come up again if John wasn't ordained, Eutropius said. So Theophilus caved in and Isidore didn't get the job, which left Theophilus seething with resentment. And Theophilus was the kind of character who could keep a grudge going. John, on the other hand, was not a politician. He was a great preacher, but when it came to playing the political games that were Theophilus's top skill, he just wasn't up to snuff. Worse yet, John would always go for the applause-getting line, even if he should have known that it would get him in trouble. Applause was a big thing in church in those days, by the way. When a preacher said something the congregation liked, they gave him enthusiastic applause. Sometimes John tried to persuade them to stop and listen in respectful silence. But when he said that, they clapped and cheered. And he loved the applause. He admitted it. It made him feel good to know that he had delivered a real zinger. That would be his downfall, in fact. The problem with the applause wasn't just that it stoked the preacher's vanity, or that it meant that the congregation appreciated zingers more than sound doctrine. John saw that the love of applause could lead preachers to say things they shouldn't have said, merely for the sake of working the crowd. If John had been as good at taking advice as he was at giving it, he might have had a much more comfortable life. John Chrysostom had never really set out to be a celebrity preacher. What he had wanted to do with his life was to go out into the desert and live the life of an ascetic monk. But he was so rigorously ascetic that he ruined his health and had come back to the city. Nevertheless, he had an instinctive distaste for luxury, and he often preached sermons bashing the luxurious lives of the rich. The poor in his congregation cheered and clapped. Then he came to Constantinople, the seat of the emperor's court. If you hated luxury, Constantinople was not the place for you. The women of the court used silver chamber pots. John couldn't get over it. Is your excrement so important to you that you have to deposit it in silver? You can imagine how the court ladies reacted to sermons like that. But we can be pretty sure that the poor in the church were clapping and cheering. Who else gave them a sermon about chamber pots? Who else socked it to the rich like that? John was their hero. The applause kept coming. Meanwhile, John lost his patron in a spectacular way. The usual conspiracies and counter-conspiracies finally caught up with Eutropius the eunuch, and he ended up fleeing to the great church for refuge. There, while Eutropius was clinging to the altar, John preached a sermon on the text, "All is vanity," from Ecclesiastes. It was a masterpiece. He managed to persuade the emperor to let Eutropius leave the city safely and go into exile. Of course, the emperor brought him back a few months later to kill him, but that was Byzantine politics for you. John went back to offending the rich as usual, but now without the power of Eutropius to protect him from the consequences. Of all the offended court ladies, none was more implacably offended than the Empress Eudoxia herself. John berated her for her greed and vanity. Vain and greedy empresses don't like that. She was determined to get rid of him. And who would help her do it? Well, the Archbishop of Alexandria was also nursing a grudge. It took a lot of devious dealing and calling in of favors, but Theophilus managed to have John condemned for heresy and exiled. Then strange things happened at the palace, and the superstitious emperor called him back. And what did John do? He insulted the empress again, this time over a statue of her that was the focus of public celebrations. The next exile was his last. The emperor sent him farther and farther away until John died at the far end of the Black Sea. The Chrysostom affair established a precedent in Constantinople that would remain the rule for much of its history. When the patriarch and the emperor came into conflict, the emperor tended to win. And it didn't matter that John's reputation was ultimately rehabilitated in Constantinople. He might be a saint, but his miserable earthly end was always there for the current patriarch of Constantinople to look back on. This made the church in the east diverge gradually from the church in the west. When we come to Milan, we'll meet a bishop who could tell one of the most powerful emperors in history that he had to wait outside with the other repentant sinners until his bishop was good and ready to let him back into church. Possibly by random luck, and possibly because of the characters of the bishops involved, the precedent in the West was that the bishops would not bow to the emperor's will. They might suffer for it as much as John did, but the other bishops would rally round, and the emperor would not get his way in the end. To a Catholic, moving the capital of the Roman Empire away from Rome seems like part of the divine plan. It left the popes in Rome hundreds of miles from the imperial court. Even when the empire was divided into western and eastern halves, the western emperors usually lived at either Milan or Ravenna. Whole reigns could pass without an emperor setting foot in Rome. By the year 476, imperial authority had almost completely vanished in the West. Left to themselves, the popes could exercise an independent authority. They could base their decisions on doctrine rather than on the whims of the imperial court. And the eastern bishops relied on that independence as their only defense against the latest emperor's whims. As for the emperors, they never learned. It was always an irresistible temptation for Byzantine emperors to interfere in theological controversies, and as the court became more Byzantine, the sufferings of the bishops and theologians who got in the emperor's way grew more extreme. Maximus the Confessor was a monk and theologian who happened to get caught up in a big fight over the question of Jesus' will. The whole history of the Age of the Fathers is a history of big fights over the nature of Christ. In this one, the question was whether Christ had only one will, a position known as monothelitism, from the Greek word meaning one will, It seemed like a good compromise that might end the fight over whether Christ had two natures, a human nature and a divine nature, or only one. Emperors were supposed to bring people together, right? But the theology was wrong. Rome weighed in. If Christ had a human and a divine nature, then Christ had a human and a divine will. This was not pleasing to the emperor. He ordered Maximus to fall in line. Maximus referred to the decision of the Pope. Now, Maximus never wanted to be a hero of the faith. He was just a peace-loving monk. He could be very accommodating. But the one thing he could not do was tell lies about the faith. The emperor had his tongue cut out and his hand cut off, which was becoming the usual Byzantine style of discipline. Thus Maximus earned his title of confessor, someone who suffered for the faith, but was not an outright martyr. Once again, Maximus was vindicated after he died. The Second Council of Constantinople, the Sixth Ecumenical Council, decided he had been right about the double will of Christ. But the emperors never learned. They kept trying to force their own ideas of theology on the church, and in the East, they often succeeded. The Eastern Roman Empire, historians call it the Byzantine Empire, somehow straggled on until 1453. For most of that time, Constantinople was its capital, although for a few decades in the 1200s, Constantinople fell into the hands of Western European crusaders. By the 1400s, the city was pretty much all that was left of the Roman Empire, but it still took Mehmet the Conqueror a titanic effort to conquer it. The very last emperor was named Constantine, Constantine X. He died fighting on the walls. But the Turkish conquest didn't extinguish the church in Constantinople. The Patriarch of Constantinople is still the head of the Greek Orthodox Church. Until a century ago, Constantinople, or Istanbul to the Turks, still had a Greek population in the hundreds of thousands. But repeated outbreaks of ethnic violence chased most of the Greeks away, and today there are a few thousand at most. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Way of the Fathers, and if you did, I ask you to consider making a donation to help us. We are entirely listener-funded, so we're utterly dependent on you. So please go now to our form at catholicculture.org/donate/audio. Send us your gift and let us know that you love the Fathers. And remember, we pray for our listeners and benefactors every day.
De quorum solemnitate gaudent angeli et collaudant filium Dei.
Way of the Fathers is a production of CatholicCulture.org. Check out our other podcasts, including Catholic Culture audiobooks, bringing to life classic Catholic writings. Criteria, the Catholic Film Podcast, featuring deep analysis of great films from a Catholic perspective. And the Catholic Culture Podcast, an interview show exploring Catholic arts, culture, and issues. You'll find all of this, as well as Catholic news, commentary, liturgical year resources, and much more at CatholicCulture.org.